Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So today, not an extensively long video, a quick synopsis of what is happening on the ground over the last 24 hours. But needless to say, unfortunately for the Ukrainian side of the equation, the casualties in the ongoing offensive south of Kharkiv have been absolutely murderous for the Ukrainian side. I have had the opportunity to analyze a number of video footage that takes place in this area. And as we have talked about before, in terms of the continued use by Russian forces of, number one, artillery, and not just indirect artillery fire, and I'm referring to actual laser-guided artillery, the Krasnopol laser-guided 152 millimeter artillery system. In conjunction with that, multiple launch rocket systems, and more importantly, new weapon systems that the Russians have put online and are starting to use in increased numbers, namely the Lancet, as I talked about in previous episodes, and then finally the LMUR, the tactical missile, the medium-range tactical missile with a range of 14 kilometers. The Russians may also be using that system in a ground-launched mode as well. Obviously, all systems that the Russians are using are not being publicly announced. The Russians have classified systems that they're actively using, and a number of the videos show weapon systems very precisely attacking Ukrainian armored columns that are trying to push south. We have seen not just one weapon system, but a multitude of weapon systems attack the Ukrainian convoys, the Ukrainian company-size strength elements that are launching these probing attacks within the vicinity of Robotyne and other areas south of Kharkiv in this area. And again, the political leadership in Kiev really appears to be focused on some sort of tangible victory, whether it's the seizure of Melitopol or the continued drive possibly to Tokmak or some other locale south of Kharkiv, between Zaporizhzhia and Volhodar in this area. But at this point, again, just based on video evidence, the Ukrainian level of casualties is just off the charts. I mean, appalling casualties are occurring within these Ukrainian formations as they try to drive south, and it's a reoccurring scenario, and it is a lesson in insanity, quite literally. What we're seeing, these columns drive south, they get caught in minefields, they don't have the proper training or understanding to dissolve a minefield, especially to do that while under attack. It's one thing to get rid of a minefield that just exists. It's a challenging operation, and given the heavy use of artillery in this conflict, it makes it very difficult to use metal detecting devices that could identify or help to identify certain landmines. Not all landmines are made out of metal. Have that in mind. Some are made of plastic and are very difficult to be detected. And the only real way to get rid of these minefields is by explosion or by probing the ground and then plowing up that ground and getting rid of those fields. But again, The challenge is when you're getting rid of a minefield, you're not moving very fast. It's a very intent-based process. And when that happens, you're not moving very fast. Now, when you're not moving very fast, that gives the Russians the opportunity to launch these Lancets, Krasnopols, laser-guided artillery, and regular artillery, and then obviously fixed-wing aircraft. So incredibly challenging environment for these Ukrainians, and they are just getting slaughtered south of Orkiv. And this may be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and maybe we don't see these types of offensives anymore by the Ukrainians. Again, the casualty levels off the chart and incredibly heavy, both in manpower and materiel. The Ukrainians do not have an unlimited supply of heavy armored fighting vehicles. They have a constant inflow of MRAPs and other vehicles, but those vehicles are proving to be very susceptible to heavy artillery fire. An artillery round does not have to hit those vehicles to cause catastrophic damage to the crew. And we're finding that out now as this conflict continues, and especially the use of laser-guided artillery, and then again these kamikaze drones and these anti-tank guided weapon systems, just to make it a very difficult proposition for Ukrainian forces. There hasn't been, again, a breakthrough in this area. We'll pull up the defensive area of the map, and you can kind of see the Ukrainians have essentially been stuck. I can only believe that there is a battalion-sized element that attempted operations in this area, and probably another battalion reinforced company in this area. So we're not talking about massive numbers of forces that the Ukrainians are sending south, but every time they send them south, they're just getting torn to bits. And that's just based off of actual video evidence of what we're seeing on the ground as this war continues to take shape. Again, if you are on the offensive in this war, you are facing an incredibly difficult challenge, again, because of the precision of modern weaponry and then the ability to sense those vehicles on the move. The Russians, as do the Ukrainians, have the ability to see these vehicles very quickly. And then once those vehicles are identified as hostile targets on the move, it is just literally a matter of seconds, minutes before the opposing side is able to call for fire on those assets, and they die in place. And that's what's happening. Again, this is a true multi-domain conflict where you have to have an air force. You have to have the ability to jam and knock drones out of the sky, and we are seeing that to some extent. The Russian electronic warfare capability right now exceeds what we're seeing by Western nation states deploying, whereas the Ukrainians deploy some very high-end HIMARS and other systems. Now, finally, one other issue I wanted to talk about very quickly is we continue to hear about two narratives. One narrative is the Ukrainian fighting soldier is an incredibly competent soldier, very good at what he does. And then the other narrative is that the Russian soldier is incredibly incompetent here in the West. Its leadership is broken, and they have low morale. Now, I'm going to argue against that. I'm going to argue that, first off, indeed, the Ukrainians do have some very good combat units. And we saw those combat units perform very well at the start of this conflict, especially in defensive operations and in some cases counterattack operations in areas such as Hostomel, north of Kiev. Okay? And those Ukrainian units performed incredibly well. Does that mean that just because those Ukrainian units performed very well and were highly proficient, that the Russian side was incompetent? No, that's not what that means. At the very beginning of this war, if you go back and listen to some of my videos, I had anticipated that based on the information that we were getting, the Ukrainian military was a lot different than what the Russians went up against early in, say, 2014. When the Russians seized Crimea, that was a different Ukrainian armed forces. Fast forward to 2022, 2023, and especially 2022, obviously the Ukrainians have lost a lot of personnel, and you have to question how good are some of these units now. Obviously, they still have good units, but again, they've taken a lot of casualties, and these units have been attrited, and they're just not the same quality because they've been backfilled with conscripts and maybe people who don't want to fight. But again, that doesn't make, if you have a highly proficient force, that doesn't mean the Russians are incompetent. It's not what that means. It just means the Russians were going up against a very competent force. And I don't think you can compare and contrast. It's very difficult to look at maybe what happened in Iraq during the U.S. march up to Baghdad, and then compare the quality of U.S. forces maybe with the quality of Ukrainian or Russian forces. This is a completely different ballgame. If the United States had faced forces as proficient as some of these Ukrainian units, maybe in Iraq, and obviously the terrain is different as well, and the capabilities that the Ukrainians possess was a lot different than what the Iraqis or the Taliban possessed. So I would argue, as you assess what's happening with Russia against Ukraine, I would say, temper the concept that the Russian military is incompetent. They were on the offensive, facing a highly competent, in some cases, armed force in the Ukrainian military. And I think that needs to be talked about, discussed, and it's just not the Ukrainians are supermen underdogs and the Russians are incompetent. That's not what's happening in this conflict. Yeah, we have seen incompetencies on both sides of the fight, but that does not make the Russian military incompetent, and it doesn't make the Ukrainian side completely supermen. The Ukrainian military, again, is probably more proficient than anything the United States has faced in recent memory outside of the German army in the 1940s. That's what I would argue. So again, as you compare and contrast the capabilities of U.S. forces, U.S. ground forces, U.S. Army, U.S. Marines, and then you try to compare and contrast the performance of Russian forces against the Ukrainians have had a lot of time to train, build up. They've had operational experience, vast amounts of operational experience against Russian forces. So again, temper that narrative, that false narrative. So that's kind of where we're at for today. We will continue to watch things here in the South as the renewed Ukrainian offensive appears to be stalled. And as always, thanks for joining us today. More to come very soon. Have a good day.